Fred Bergman is Senior Policy Advisor with Atlantic Economic Council. Mr. Bergman, now that we have another Trump administration, what could that mean economically speaking for this region?
Well, certainly we saw during the last Trump administration that we had to renegotiate NAFTA, and it became what we now call in Canada CUSMA, the Canada-U.S.-Mexico Free Trade Agreement, with obviously some concessions there. I think we saw some tariffs during Trump's administration on things like steel and aluminum, if I recall. Trump, during his election platform commitment, so I think one of them was to levy a tariff of 10% or more on all countries, including Canada, despite our free trade agreement. So this could certainly create some friction and also increase the cost of exporting to the U.S. for Canadian manufacturers and other exporters. So it would reduce our businesses' competitiveness. And certainly it would create some other issues in terms of the dispute resolution mechanism, even within CUSMA. It may take a few years for that to weed its way through the system to address such tariffs, which should not be allowed under CUSMA.
So, I mean, that's a good point. Clearly, dealing with a protectionist type government is challenging at the best of times. Any sense of what it could mean economically in terms of kind of dollar impact or the size of the issue?
Well, certainly it's hard to assess the exact impact, but we do know last year, for example, Nova Scotia exported about $4.4 billion worth of goods to the U.S., and that was about 67% of what's called our international merchandise goods exports. So it's certainly a large player for companies like Michelin, North America, for example, which might export tires to the U.S., or Clearwater Seafoods that might export live lobster to the U.S. And those are just two hypothetical examples.
You alluded earlier there to the earlier Trump administration. We've seen the movie before, but might things be any different this time around compared to the last Trump administration?
Well, that's a good question. Like, Canada since then has implemented a digital services tax on the U.S. So companies like Google or Meta or even Twitter would be subject to, now called X, would be subject to that digital services tax. I know the other incumbent that was running for presidency had committed to address that through some sort of reciprocal or residual measure against Canada. The question mark is, will Trump try to address that as well? So will the gloves come off?
Yeah, so we'll see what happens there in due course, I suppose. But, if you're a consumer watching this, you're thinking about inflation maybe being a factor in all this. How real and how impactful could that be?
Well, certainly if it becomes a tit for tat, like, the U.S. levies tariffs on our exports to the U.S., and then Canada starts levying tariffs on U.S. Imports into Canada, certainly that will impact supply chains on both sides of the border, as well as inflation potentially on both sides of the border. But it's hard to predict. It's a wait and see of what exact goods are impacted. Is it all goods? Is it only certain goods and services, and how does this trickle down to the everyday household or consumer? So that's a wait and see, but yes, it could have inflationary impacts on pricing because tariffs add to the cost of things.
And so when you think about all of that, is Nova Scotia or this region, the economy here, any more exposed or less exposed than anywhere else?
Well, certainly we were already exposed, even pre-Trump. Like, we've had tariffs on softwood lumber for a number of years, but it's only applies to New Brunswick and other provinces outside the region. So the rest of the Atlantic provinces have been effectively exempted from the softwood lumber tariffs. But forest producers in New Brunswick have been having to pay softwood lumber tariffs to the U.S. In order to export their lumber to the U.S. for a number of years now. So it's a question mark of, will this make that issue worse or better? That's a wait and see. But we're already seeing impacts of existing tariffs, let alone what might come from the Trump administration.
And so overall, generally speaking, how much of a drag on the economy could that mean?
Well, certainly it could be significant if there was a 10% or more tariff on all Canadian exports of goods and services to the U.S. That's going to be a significant drag in the economy. But let's face it, diplomatically, Canada would take significant efforts to address it. That's a massive tariff. And I don't want to send fear down the economy or through supply chains, but we have to recognize there are definitely risks. I think there will be something forthcoming that's not going to be good for Canada, but let's not, ring the alarm bell like the sky is falling at the same time, because there are means to address some of these issues. We do have CUSMA. We do have a dispute resolution mechanism. We can fall back on that. There's lots of options for Canada to address this, go forward. And if anything, these two countries, we're long-standing allies. We're long-standing trading partners. There's long-standing supply chain relationships between all three countries within CUSMA, within North America. Let's face it, U.S. companies don't want those supply chains impacted too much either. So I'm sure they'll have a strong vocal voice in this, not just Canada.
Yeah, we shall see how it all plays out, of course. Fred Bergman, thank you so much.
Yeah, you're welcome.